Before freezers, ice was the most valuable cargo on Earth. 1896. New York City, July. The heat won't break. 10 days above 100 degrees. In the tenements of the Lower East Side, milk turns sour before it reaches the icebox. Meat goes green on the butcher's block. Mothers watch their infants grow feverish, then still. City morgues fill within 72 hours. Doctors call it the dying season, the stretch of summer when disease tears through neighborhoods faster than anyone can bury the dead. In 2 weeks, over 1,300 people are gone in this city alone, most of them children under 2. Not from a plague, not from war, from spoiled food, because in 1896 there is no refrigerator, no freezer, no cold air on demand. There is only one thing standing between a family's dinner and a death sentence: a block of frozen water delivered by a stranger, melting in a wooden box in the kitchen. Ice. And if that ice doesn't arrive, if the price climbs too high, if the delivery wrap breaks down, if the winter before was too warm to freeze enough of it, people die, quietly, in their own homes, by the thousands, every single summer. Today, ice is nothing. You crush it into a drink and don't think twice. It falls out of a machine in your freezer door, endless, free, boring. But for most of American history, ice was the most valuable cargo on Earth, rarer than coffee, more fought over than oil, a commodity so essential that entire fortunes, entire shipping empires, entire city survival rates depended on whether a wooden crate packed with frozen pond water made it from Massachusetts to Manhattan before it turned to water. This is the story of that block of ice, how something that melts in your hand became one of the most profitably traded goods in the 19th century, how one bankrupt, humiliated young man convinced the world to pay for something that had always fallen from the sky for free, and how the absence of it, one bad summer, one broken icehouse, one price spike, was the difference between a city that ate safely and a city that buried its children. Because before there was a machine humming quietly in your kitchen, keeping everything cold, there was a war being fought over frozen water. A war with fortunes made, ships lost, prisons filled, and lives, thousands of them, decided by a single question: would the ice get there in time? This is the history of ice, the most disposable thing in your freezer today, and once, the difference between life and death. To understand how frozen water became a global commodity, you have to go back, not to 1896, not even to America. Humans have wanted ice for a very long time. Long before anyone understood why cold preserved food, they understood that it did. In ancient Persia, engineers were building massive conical structures called yakhchals as early as 400 BC, mud brick towers rising from the desert floor, designed to trap and store ice through the brutal heat of summer. Persian builders would channel water into shallow pools on winter nights, let it freeze in the desert's cold air, then pack the resulting ice into deep underground chambers insulated with straw and clay. Some of these structures kept ice solid for months, in a region where daytime temperatures regularly cross 100 degrees. The Romans did something similar, if less elegant. Wealthy citizens sent servants up into the Apennine Mountains to harvest packed snow, which was then hauled down and stored in straw-lined pits, sold in the markets of Rome as a luxury for the emperor's table. Chinese texts describe ice houses used as far back as 1000 BC, built specifically to preserve food for royal courts through hot months. In every one of these civilizations, the pattern was identical. Ice existed, ice was useful, and ice was almost impossible to keep. It was a privilege reserved entirely for the wealthy and powerful, because harvesting, transporting, and storing something that actively wants to melt is one of the most logistically punishing problems in the history of commerce. For thousands of years, that's where it stayed. A luxury, a curiosity. Something an emperor might have, and a farmer never would. Nobody had figured out how to make ice ordinary. Nobody had figured out how to make it profitable at scale. And certainly nobody had figured out how to ship it somewhere it had never existed at all. To a place where the very concept of a frozen drink was, to most of the population, a joke. That's exactly what one young man from Boston decided to attempt in 1805. And nearly everyone who heard the plan thought he'd lost his mind. His name was Frederic Tudor, 22 years old, from a wealthy Boston family, restless, and, by his own family's account, stubborn to the point of self-destruction. Tudor's idea was absurd on its face. He wanted to cut ice from the frozen ponds of Massachusetts in the dead of winter, load it onto a ship, sail it thousands of miles south to the tropical Caribbean, and sell it to people who had never once in their lives touched anything cold. His own brother, who was supposed to help run the operation, thought the plan was hopeless enough that he barely tried. Boston's business community didn't take the idea seriously enough to even bother mocking it properly. That would come later, once Tudor had actually attempted it. On February 13th, 1806, Tudor loaded 130 tons of ice onto a ship called the Favourite and set sail for the island of Martinique. The Boston Gazette covered the departure with open sarcasm. "No joke," the paper wrote. "A vessel has cleared at the custom house for Martinique with a cargo of ice. We hope this will not prove a slippery speculation." It was worse than slippery. It was a disaster. Tudor's brother had sailed ahead to arrange buyers and storage on the island, and had done neither. There was no insulated building waiting to receive the cargo. There was no established market of Caribbean customers eager to purchase frozen water at any price, because nobody on the island had ever needed to keep anything cold in their entire lives. By the time the Favourite's hold was opened in the tropical heat, a devastating percentage of the cargo had already turned to seawater and run out through the bilge. What survived sat largely unsold, melting in real time, while local residents regarded the entire venture with a mixture of confusion and amusement. Frederic Tudor returned to Boston humiliated and deep in debt. Most young men in his position would have quietly abandoned the idea and spent the rest of their lives pretending it never happened. Tudor tried again, and failed again, and tried again after that. Over the following years, he refined almost nothing about the actual product. Ice was ice, but he obsessively refined everything around it. How it was packed, how it was insulated, how fast it could move from a frozen New England pond to a waiting ship's hold before the summer sun could touch it. He experimented with sawdust as an insulating material, discovering that a thick enough layer could slow melting dramatically during a long ocean voyage. He went to debtor's prison over the losses from his early attempts. He came out and tried again anyway. In his private journal, during one of the lowest points of this stretch, Tudor wrote a single line that would later become almost a personal motto: "Let those laugh who win." It would take him nearly 2 more decades of failure, debt, and stubborn engineering before that line stopped sounding like denial and started sounding like a prophecy. Because what Frederic Tudor was building, one disastrous shipment at a time, wasn't just a business. It was about to become one of the strangest and most profitable trades in American history. And it was going to convince the entire world that frozen water was worth paying for. By 1810, Frederic Tudor had lost most of what his family had. But he had also learned something no one else in America understood yet. Ice was not a product. It was a logistics problem wearing a product's disguise. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source: sawdust. New England's sawmills produced mountains of it as waste, and Tudor discovered that packing ice blocks in thick layers of the stuff created an insulating barrier good enough to survive weeks at sea. Suddenly, a cargo that used to arrive as seawater was arriving as ice. Real, solid, sellable ice. He paired that with something just as important: patience with the customer. Tudor started giving ice away for free to bartenders and hotel owners in the ports he shipped to. Not selling it, giving it away. He understood something that would define consumer marketing for the next 2 centuries. People don't ask for what they've never experienced. But once someone tastes a cold drink on a sweltering afternoon, they don't go back to a warm one. Ever. It worked exactly as he predicted. By 1815, Tudor had established a functioning, if fragile, ice trade with Cuba. By 1820, ports across the Caribbean and the American South were placing standing orders. By 1833, nearly 30 years after that humiliating first voyage to Martinique, Tudor did something that sounded, even to his own investors, like a fantasy. He shipped 180 tons of New England ice on a 4-month voyage across 2 oceans to Calcutta, India. It arrived 2/3 intact. It sold instantly at a staggering profit to a British colonial population desperate for anything that could cut through the subcontinent's brutal heat. Frederic Tudor, the man Boston had laughed at, the man who'd gone to debtor's prison chasing frozen water, had just proven that a New England pond in January could supply a colonial outpost on the other side of the planet in June. Newspapers started calling him what history would remember him as, the Ice King. But Tudor wasn't the only piece of this puzzle, because shipping ice was only half the problem. The other half was cutting it, and that problem was solved by a man most people have never heard of, working the frozen ponds of Massachusetts with an invention that looked almost too simple to matter. His name was Nathaniel Wyeth, and in 1825 he patented a horse-drawn ice cutter, a plough-like blade that could score perfectly straight uniform lines into a frozen pond's surface. Before Wyeth's invention, cutting ice was slow, brutal, irregular work done by hand with saws and axes, producing lumpy, inconsistent blocks that wasted space in a ship's hold and melted unevenly. Wyeth's cutter changed that completely. Teams of workers could now score a pond into a perfect grid, then use levers to pop out uniform rectangular blocks by the hundreds, stackable, transportable, and dramatically more efficient to insulate. Between Tudor's shipping innovations and Wyeth's harvesting technology, an entire industry exploded into existence almost overnight. What had been one eccentric young man's obsession became, by the 1850s, one of the largest export businesses in New England. Frozen ponds that had sat quiet and useless every winter for generations were suddenly worth more than the farmland surrounding them. Entire towns reorganized their economies around the ice harvest. Men who spent summers as farmers or dock workers spent winters on the ice, cutting, hauling, and packing thousands of tons of frozen water yet into massive insulated ice houses built specifically to hold the harvest until shipping season. By 1855, 12 separate companies were shipping ice out of the Boston area alone, all competing directly in the market Tudor had built from nothing. Ice had become astonishingly the second most transported commodity leaving American ports, trailing only cotton. Ships that once carried nothing but raw goods south now carried frozen New England winter to Havana, to Charleston, to New Orleans, to Bombay, to Singapore, to nearly every port city hot enough to want it and wealthy enough to pay for it. By the time Frederic Tudor died in 1864 at the age of 80, the industry he had built through 2 decades of failure, debt, and stubborn refusal to quit was worth millions of dollars a year. An almost unimaginable sum for a business built entirely on a product that could vanish into thin air if you left it in the sun too long. But here is the detail that made this entire industry so dangerous, so unstable, and eventually so deadly for the people who depended on it most. Frederic Tudor had built an empire on something that occurs naturally, seasonally, and unpredictably. He had built a global commodity on the weather itself, and weather, unlike Tudor's ambition, could not be controlled. By the 1880s, ice wasn't just big business, it was essential infrastructure, as critical to a city's survival as its water supply or its roads. And whenever something becomes that essential, the people who control it stop thinking like tradesmen and start thinking like rulers. American cities had become completely dependent on natural ice within a single generation. Iceboxes sat in nearly 2/3 of households in Boston and New York by the time of the Civil War. Meatpackers in Chicago needed it to ship beef east without it rotting in transit. Breweries needed it to keep beer cold through fermentation. Hospitals needed it to preserve medicine and cool feverish patients. Dairies needed it to keep milk from turning before it reached a single doorstep. An entire modern urban economy, food, medicine, industry, had quietly rebuilt itself around a product that came from a frozen pond in New England, and could only be harvested during the handful of weeks each winter when the temperature dropped low enough. That dependency created an opportunity, and in New York City, one man decided to seize all of it at once. His name was Charles W. Morse, and by the late 1890s, he had methodically bought up nearly every major ice company supplying Manhattan, consolidating them into a single entity that newspapers began calling, without much exaggeration, the Ice Trust. By 1900, Morse's American Ice Company controlled somewhere close to 70% of the natural ice supply here flowing into New York City, a city of over 3 million people, almost entirely dependent on ice deliveries to keep food and medicine safe through the summer months. Morse understood exactly what he now held, not a business, a chokehold. In May of 1900, without warning, the American Ice Company doubled its prices overnight. A product that had cost the average family roughly 30 cents for £100 suddenly cost 60. For the wealthy, this was an inconvenience. For the poor, crowded into the same tenement districts that had buried 1,300 people in the 1896 heat wave, it was a direct threat to survival. Families that had budgeted carefully for ice deliveries now faced an impossible choice: pay double, or go without the one thing standing between their food and spoilage, their infants and dehydration, their sick, and a fever that wouldn't break. Newspapers erupted, investigations followed. It emerged that Morse's company had secured its dominance partly through political corruption. Reports surfaced that New York's own mayor, Robert Van Wyck, held a significant undisclosed stake in the American Ice Company itself, meaning the city's chief elected official stood to personally profit from a price hike that endangered his poorest constituents. The scandal became a national symbol of Gilded Age corporate greed, a handful of men controlling the one commodity an entire city needed to survive summer and manipulating its price for personal fortune, while people who couldn't afford the new rate were left to gamble with spoiled food and rising fevers. Public outrage eventually forced the company to roll prices back. But the deeper problem the Ice Trust scandal exposed wasn't corruption alone, it was fragility. An entire civilization's food safety network was being run through a supply chain that depended on cold winters, clean ponds, and the goodwill of whoever happened to own the harvesting rights that year. And nature, it turned out, didn't care about any of that. Natural ice could only be harvested when temperatures dropped low enough for long enough. A mild winter meant a thin harvest meant a summer shortage, and a summer shortage meant exactly the kind of catastrophe the industry had spent a century trying to prevent from happening in the first place. These shortages became known, grimly, as ice famines, and they hit hardest exactly where the human cost was highest. There was a second, quieter danger too. As American cities industrialized, the very ponds and rivers ice companies harvested from began filling with sewage, factory runoff, and waste from the same crowded populations depending on that ice to stay healthy. Ice cut from a contaminated river carried whatever was floating in that water directly into iceboxes, milk coolers, and drinking glasses across the city. The very product meant to protect families from the disease was, in some cases, quietly delivering it straight into their kitchens, a fact public health officials were only beginning to understand and warn about as the 20th century approached. The ice industry had grown so large, so essential, and so unregulated that it had become something more dangerous than any single monopolist. It had become a single point of failure for an entire civilization's food safety, vulnerable to weather, to corruption, to contamination, and to the greed of whoever happened to be standing at the top of the supply chain in a given year. And in 1906, all three of those vulnerabilities were about to collide at once. The summer of 1906 delivered the disaster the ice industry had been quietly risking for 100 years. The winter before had been unusually mild across New England. Ponds that should have frozen solid enough to cut for months only froze thin, and only for weeks. Harvests across the region came in dramatically short. Some ice houses reported barely a third of their normal stock going into storage. Nobody outside the industry noticed the shortfall in January. By July, everybody did. As supply collapsed, prices didn't just rise, they became unpredictable, spiking block by block depending on which company you bought from and how desperate that week's shortage had become. Poor families who had barely managed the doubled prices from the Ice Trust scandal 6 years earlier now faced ice that was scarce at any price. Deliveries that used to arrive daily started arriving every few days, then irregularly, then not at all in the poorest neighborhoods, where companies quietly prioritized wealthier customers who could pay premium rates for what little ice remained. The consequences landed exactly where they always had. Infant mortality climbed through the tenement districts of New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Milk, undelivered or unrefrigerated, soured on doorsteps and in iceboxes, gone warm. Meat turned in butcher shops that couldn't get blocks large enough to keep their coolers functioning. Hospitals rationed the ice they used to bring down fevers in the sickest patients. Public health officials, who had spent a decade warning about contaminated harvest ponds, now had a second crisis, stacked directly on top of the first. A system that was simultaneously too scarce and too dirty to trust. Newspapers that had covered the Ice Trust as a story about corporate greed now covered the 1906 famine as something closer to a public health emergency and pointed out, with real anger, that an entire modern city's survival through summer rested on something as fragile and unregulated as whether a New England pond had frozen thick enough that January, A civilization that could build skyscrapers, span rivers with steel bridges, and wire electricity into 1 million homes was still, in the most literal sense, praying for cold weather to keep its children alive. This is the moment. The natural ice trade revealed exactly what it had always been. Not infrastructure, but a gamble. 100 years of engineering, shipping innovation, and fortune building had never actually solved the industry's central weakness. It had only concealed it, one mild winter away from exposure, and it was already too late to fix the system Tudor had built, because while ice barons were consolidating monopolies and cities were burying their poorest children, a separate, quieter revolution had been unfolding in laboratories most Americans had never heard of, one that didn't depend on frozen ponds, sawdust insulation, or the goodwill of a New England winter at all. Mechanical refrigeration had existed in crude form since the 1830s, but it had remained an industrial curiosity, bulky, expensive, and largely confined to breweries and meat-packing plants that could afford the machinery and accept the risk. The coolant gases those early systems used were often toxic, sometimes explosive, and entirely impractical for a household kitchen. For decades, mechanical cold remained something only industry could use, while ordinary families stayed completely dependent on the same fragile natural harvest that had just failed them in 1906. But the famine changed the calculation. It proved, in the most brutal terms possible, that a civilization could not keep gambling its food safety and its children's lives on the weather. The pressure that had been building quietly in engineering labs across America and Germany for decades suddenly had a national tragedy behind it, a public furious enough to demand a permanent fix, and a market desperate enough to pay for one. The era of the Ice King was ending. Somewhere in a workshop, the machine that would finally replace him, reliable, mechanical, weatherproof cold, was already taking shape. The fix took longer than anyone in 1906 could have imagined, nearly 2 more decades of refinement before it reached an ordinary kitchen. In 1927, General Electric released the monitor-top refrigerator, the first model that combined a compressor and a cold box into a single, self-contained unit a family could actually own. It was loud, it ran hot, it cost roughly $300, a genuine fortune during the era, but it worked every single day, in every kind of weather, without a delivery man, without a melting block, without a single frozen pond anywhere in the equation. Within a generation, the entire industry Frederic Tudor had built from a humiliating shipwreck of a first voyage simply stopped existing. Icemen stopped making their rounds. Ice houses shut down one by one across New England. The ponds that had once been worth more than the farmland around them went back to being just ponds. By 1955, 80% of American homes owned a mechanical refrigerator. The dying season, that grim, predictable stretch of summer death that had haunted American cities for over a century, quietly disappeared from public health records within a single generation. Nobody threw a parade for it. It just stopped happening, and eventually, nobody alive remembered it any other way. Today, ice is the least valuable thing in your kitchen. It falls from a dispenser in your freezer door, endless and free, and you'd never think to insure it, monopolize it, or risk your life to ship it across an ocean. But look closer, and the pattern Frederic Tudor discovered 2 centuries ago never actually went away. It just moved. Modern cold chains, the refrigerated trucks, ships, and warehouses that move vaccines, produce, and medicine across the planet right now, still fail in exactly the way 19th century ice deliveries used to. The World Health Organization has estimated that a significant share of vaccines shipped globally lose potency before they ever reach a patient, because somewhere along the route, refrigeration broke down. During the early rollout of COVID-19 vaccines, entire shipments were discarded worldwide when cold storage failed at a single link in the chain. The same fragile, single point of failure vulnerability that turned a mild New England winter into a body count in the summer of 1906. We didn't eliminate the danger of relying on cold. We just made it invisible, buried it in supply chains most people never think about, the same way most people in 1900 never thought about which frozen pond their ice had come from. That's the part of this story that never really ends. Every civilization reaches a point where its survival depends on something it can't fully control, and it's rarely the object itself that decides who lives and who doesn't. It's who controls it, how fragile the system around it is, and what happens the one year it fails. Frederic Frederic Tudor didn't invent ice. Nobody can invent something that already falls from the sky. What he invented was dependency. A world that had never needed frozen water suddenly built its entire summer survival around it. And once that dependency existed, it created everything that followed. Fortunes, monopolies, corruption, and a body count that arrived exactly when the weather refused to cooperate. The block of ice you drop into a glass tonight will melt in minutes, and you won't think about it again. But for 100 years, it was the difference between a city that ate safely and a city that buried its children. The technology changed, the convenience became invisible, but the underlying question Frederic Tudor's empire first exposed: what happens when the thing you can't live without suddenly isn't there? Never actually went away. It's just waiting for the next mild winter. If this kind of hidden history caught you off guard, subscribe. The next one might change how you look at something in your kitchen right now.